Hello, hello. Welcome to number 26 Discord Q&A. Feels like a lot. 26 is a really high number. When I first started doing these things, I didn't really think about how many of these I'm going to make or how long are they going to be. I just felt like, hey, this is a thing that makes sense to make. It's a thing that would probably be relatively time efficient for me to make, and I had a lot of people asking me a lot of questions all the time, and so it felt like something that just made a lot of sense to make. But I didn't really consider out the long-term ramifications of that. And at this point, I have well over 30 hours of content. All of these Q&As are over 1 hour long, and some of the earlier ones especially are way over 1 hour, right? I have one that's over 2 hours, one that's over 3 hours, for example. And looking back, the thing I'm getting at here is looking back, I think that some of the earlier Q&As, especially like the first seven-ish, are I kind of look at them and say, not only from a production standpoint, they're kind of low quality because I just do them in one take, but also I think that uh, from a question answering perspective, I was not as familiar with answering questions in this kind of like short form audio format, right? I had done streams where I answered questions, but that's like more like off the top, like very short responses, and I don't think I was quite nearly as good as I am today at answering the questions in this sort of format. I've been considering redoing the first few videos. Of course, it would take me a while because the first seven is like well over 10 hours worth of videos. But anyway, I'm considering going back, spending some time redoing the first some number of the Q and A's, like answering the same questions, but with my more modern experience and more modern production value. Actually doing cuts and not sneezing on camera and all of that. So let me know what your thoughts on that are. Because I kind of look back and I like when I was recently looking at the first couple of videos, it's like I look at them and I'm like, not only do I not like the production of the videos, but I also just think a lot of the answers are not great either, and I would answer them differently today. Anyway, but yeah, let me know your thoughts on that. If you think that would be cool, think it's not worth my time, and I should spend that time doing something else. Who knows? But yeah, just something I've been considering. Anyway, let's get into number 26 here, starting out with Tibbers getting the daisy treatment of applying on hit effects. So, a couple things going on here. One thing to note is that one big difference here between Ivern and Annie is that Ivern has an on-hit effect on his kit, right? His W gives on-hit to anyone who's standing in the bush or has been standing in the bush recently. And that's why I think originally, well, that's one of the reasons why Ivern having on-hits on his summon makes some sense. Is like, well, if he doesn't, then part of his kit doesn't work with his, doesn't actually work with his ultimate. I think that was fine, to be honest. Like, I think it was probably like ultimately, I'll just set my stance up very early on in this question, which is I think that Ivern should not have on-hit effects on Daisy for a number of different reasons. One being that, well, yeah, it can be valuable that your kit feels like your spells work together. I don't actually think this is a good example of that, right? It's a thing where you have to awkwardly W on yourself to make it so that your Daisy deals a little bit of extra on hit damage. And I think it would actually make more sense if it was your W gives all champions and summons on hit damage or whatever, right? And so you put the W on Daisy to give her the on hit buff. That would make more sense to me because that's actually how the W spell works, right? The W spell doesn't say give on hit damage to every champion standing in the bush and also all of their summons. It says give champions standing in this bush the ability to deal damage with this on hit. And if we expanded that rule to champions and large summons or whatever, right, and it also affected Tibbers and the Maiden or whatever, and that would be fine with me, right? I think that would make a lot more sense as expanding the rule in that way rather than expanding the rule as kind of a pretty large, in my opinion, like rule break. Because generally speaking, when we add on hits to a spell, that spell represents or resembles that champion's attack in some way, or it's a core hook of the champion, right? Those are the two cases that we have, right? It's like when you look at like Ezreal, his Q looks a lot like his attacks, and it's a pretty clear like this is a version of his attack, right? Same thing with what's another good example? Like Aurelia's Q. It's like, yeah, she's literally hitting you with her weapon. That applies on hit effects. Okay, cool. That makes sense. Not every version of that applies on hit effects, but I think that it is important that we are like the people are able to draw a clear connection of like, oh, this person is like attacking me in some way. And therefore, that's why they can apply on hit effects. And Ivern is currently violating that in a way that I think is not correct. There is also another version of this is core to the champion's pattern. This is like Gangplank, right? It's like Gangplank shoots you with a gun. When he attacks you with he attacks you with a sword, right? That's clearly not the same thing as his attacks, but it's also pretty core to his pattern and understandable when you see what he's doing. That's the big hook that he has is, oh yeah, he gets to do this thing at range, right? He gets to apply his Shin effects to his barrels, and that's the big thing that he does. It's a core hook, and so I think that there's from a like visibility and cleanliness of design perspective, I think it is wrong for uh for Daisy to apply on hit effects, and I would not want to do the same thing to Tibbers because I think there's even less justification there. Another thing I'll note is that I also think the gameplay of Daisy applying on hit effects is pretty poor, specifically with red buff. Like Ivern is a jungler and he gets red buff pretty regularly, and the counterplay of playing against Daisy with versus without red buff difference is actually quite large, right? Like even a small slow makes a really big difference in how much you have to dodge or whether you are able to dodge the knockup of Daisy. And Daisy does a lot of damage, right? Like that's how Daisy is structured, is that she's supposed to be this very, very, very powerful, but high counterplay thing if you're just running away from her. And that, like, yes, when Daisy is getting shields, like being supported by Ivern, like you're getting rooted by Ivern, getting slowed by the E on Daisy, then Daisy can be hard to get away from and can catch up to you and apply her knockup, do a lot of damage. But when Daisy is able to apply red buff on her own, I think that breaks down the counterplay in kind of subtle and insidious ways that I think are probably incorrect. And the actual reality is, like, if you're an Ivern player and you're thinking like, oh, but I like it when Daisy applies red buff, the reality is we could probably make Daisy a little bit faster if she didn't apply red buff, right? It's like we could just make it the same. I think that the thing that upsets me about this is not that Daisy deals a lot of damage and has some reliability, but more so that Daisy has different levels of reliability when she does or does not have red buff. I think this is different, by the way, when Ivern buys Rylai's, because that's a clear investment into this mechanic, and it's very easy for everyone in the game to understand what's happening. Whereas Daisy applying red buff is not as easy to understand. It's much more subtle and again kind of insidious that the counterplay is different, right? It's like imagine a game, as an example, where you interact with Ivern at level 6, he doesn't have red buff, you interact with Daisy, you do a specific set of actions that work, right? And then Ivern comes back 3 minutes later with red buff, and you do those exact same set of actions, but they don't work because you are now slowed a little bit by the red buff on Daisy. I think that that's wrong, right? Like I think that it's wrong that that same set of actions doesn't work anymore because Ivern has red buff, and that's not something that you can easily point to and understand. Like, oh, that same exact sequence didn't work specifically because I am now slowed by a small percentage from Ivern's red buff. I generally don't love that interaction. Anyway, we don't need to get in detail on all of that. But to summarize, I guess I'll say I think it makes a lot of sense for Shaco, for example, his ultimate to have item effects because that is him and that clone has his items, right? Not that every single item actually works on Shaco's clone. They actually don't all work perfectly. Most of the ones that you would want to work do work correctly. But I think it's correct because that clone is Shaco, has Shaco's items, and that makes like there is a clear connection that you can draw there. However, Daisy, I don't like. My personal opinion here is I don't think that Daisy should apply on hit effects. And if we want Daisy to have Ivern's W, we could just say Ivern's W, works on like large summons or works on Daisy in addition to champions, and that you should put the W on Daisy to make that happen because that's what makes sense. Like that's how the ability actually works. And I also think in general we've over supported on hits on a lot of champions. Like you can see this in our modes as well, right? I actually think that Arena, for example, especially in previous iterations of Arena, way over supported on hit effects as a method of like tying into systems. And in general, I think that we've over indexed on like champion kits interacting with on hits in unique ways, and our systems, again, especially in alt modes, having on hit tie-ins. I think that on hits can be cool. But I also think that we need to be more clear and intentional about how we use them, and making sure that when we use them, it is something that is like an attack in some way, or is core to the champion's pattern and is learnable. Whereas I actually don't think that those things are true for Daisy applying on hits, and I would not want to do the same thing for Tibbers. I do think that there is a version of Tibbers as an example where we could say Tibbers has Annie's items. That could be cool, right? A world where, well, Daisy, like let's suppose for an example, that we didn't want Tibbers to be this like powerful burn applier for like malignance specifically. It's like, imagine we gave Tibbers Annie's items, and now Tibbers is really good with Rylai's and Leandry's because he can apply them himself. And maybe that causes some interesting differences. Like, oh, when Tibbers has Storm Surge, Annie gets double value out of Storm Surge because Tibbers can also apply Storm Surge. If he, I don't know, like, do we consider Annie's ult damage as Tibbers damage or Annie's damage? There's a lot of weird questions to answer there. But if we wanted to say Tibbers has Annie's items, I think that's very different than Tibbers applies Annie's on hit effects, because there's a very clear story difference there. And so in general, I'm not really a big fan of this idea, but I think that there are versions of Tibbers that could apply some on-hit effects from like items and things like that could be cool. But this specific pitch, I'm not personally a big fan of. Is designing items that has to fit into Runeterra limiting or easy given the many regions? So designing items, like if you go back and look at the question I answered in the last video, 25, where is that? Am I griefing? Where's that question? Oh, here we go. This one. Talking about champion design. Item design is actually quite a bit different. When we design items, generally speaking, like especially when I personally design items, other people have different methods, but when I design items, I don't start with a theme. In fact, as you might be aware if you've ever heard me talk about this, I generally start with, I name the item something ridiculous and I give it a ridiculous icon, because that makes it very obvious it's a playtest item. Because one of the problems that I've run into many times in the past is when you're in a playtest, people will often autopilot and not build items that are in dev, right? It's like when they're playing a new champion, it's like they can't really get away from or they're testing a new map change or whatever, right? It's hard for them to get away from testing that thing. But I traditionally actually run into a lot of trouble getting people to buy in dev items, especially if it's not a first item. And so by making the name of the item something memorable and ridiculous and giving it a ridiculous icon that stands out amongst the other icons in the shop, it's much easier to get testing on them. And so I don't start with a theme. Sometimes I have some vague idea of what it could be, right? Like Malignance, for example, most of the time in development, it was called Flame Speaker. And the idea was that it was this, the idea was that it was like a staff that, burned the ground beneath your targets. And of course, we changed it to an item that was more like poison themed, right? Like the Malignance is more about it's not, the ground's not on fire, it's poison ground, right? But most of the time, I make items. I start with the gameplay. Like, here's the gameplay that I want, and we can figure out the theme later. And that's usually pretty easy. Sometimes it can be tough, right? Dusk and Dawn, I think, is an example where we really struggled to come up with a theme that we liked. Actualizer is another good example of that, of like we really struggled to come up with a theme that we really liked for the item, but most of the time it's pretty easy, right? Something like I don't know, what's an example from the recent batch of items. Protoplasm harness, for example. Like, hey, this is a defensive tank items, or a defensive tank item. Hey, tanks don't have a belt. They have an epic item like Giant's Belt, right? But they don't have a completed item that is a belt of any kind. Okay, like how can we theme this as a belt? Cool, we're done, right? We came up with this, the idea of that became Protoplasm, right? Honestly, coming up with the name for Protoplasm was harder than determining what it was. And so for most items, I would say that it's actually fairly easy. However, one thing I will note is that when we go through and we theme the items, people overwhelmingly pitch hex tech and chem tech items, and we actually have to resist that like pretty actively, because if we just did, oh, this is the thing that sounds good for this item, like over half of our items would be Piltover or Zon themed, because it's very easy to come up with, oh, here's an item that does a thing, and that's hex tech for some reason, or that's chem tech for some reason. Very, 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 very easy. Much, much, much more difficult to come up with items that are like from Ionia or from like Targon, for example, right? Because the type of the type of effects that we have on items really map pretty well to like Hextech and Chemtech, which is like, hey, the things that people know these regions for are external sources of power, right? Whereas Targon and Ionia, as examples, are more internal sources of power, and it's not front of mind to think of like oh, this is of course a thing that's from that region. Shurima, I would say, is also similar, although I think Shurima is a little easier, or void themed items or whatever, right? So just generally, like getting at the actual question here, it's very easy to make items that fit into Runeterra. We make items that are, or like, sorry, when I make items very heavily around gameplay first, and we do theme later, and that's usually pretty easy to do. Some people do operate differently, though. Like there are people that start with theme first and get to gameplay, and they try to design theme and gameplay, like sort of what we would, what's more called like top down design. If you think about if you've heard that term used in like Magic, uh, where you start with a theme and you design an item around that, or you kind of, I don't know if it would really be top down, but more like holistic design, I guess, where you kind of design the theme and the item around each other. Terminus is a good example of an item like that, which was like, oh, this is a, here's an on-hit item, and it's got a light and dark theme, right? The original name of that item was Contradistinction, I think. I think it was the original name, and it's like, oh, it's this alternating item that does different things every other hit, and it's going to be really cool. And I think generally speaking, those items end up often getting bogged down in uh, overselling their theme. It's very hard to sell a theme really strongly on an item, in particular, right? Like name an item that you think has a really, really, really strong thematic tie-in, right? It's like it's very hard to come up with examples there. Our items just don't carry enough gameplay weight, I think, or don't carry enough visuals most of the time to really be super heavily themed, super well themed. Whereas like maybe the best themed item is something like Redemption, as an example, because it has like a really strong visual moment, and you can actually like tell exactly what's going on there, and you can see like, oh yeah, it has a symbol that you can see when you cast it. It has this giant green circle, and it has sound effects, right? And it's difficult, I think, for a lot of our other items to carry the same level of thematic. And so I think generally our items, I think this is not just my opinion as a gameplay first designer, but just as a game designer in general. Is like I think that it is correct for items to be designed gameplay forward, or gameplay first, and for the themes to come as a secondary, rather than champions where those things need to be designed in concert in order to make sense, because items are very, very, very heavy gameplay and very light on theming in the end, whereas champions are not so, right? And so yeah, the answer to the question is I don't think it's usually that difficult. There are cases where it is, but for most people designing items, myself included, we design gameplay first and theme, figure out the theme later on, and that makes this not particularly difficult. Tom Kinch gets more value from AP by building HP. Would this idea work on on items / other champs? Could this open up more builds for other champs? I think the answer is yes, but we have to be extremely careful about how we do this. I think this kind of scaling is very dangerous. In much the same way that I think that scaling an ability with the same stat twice, in a way that's multiplicative is very dangerous, right? Examples of this would be like Hecarim Q and Volibear passive, where Volibear passive AP scales the amount of attack speed you get, which affects how many attacks per second you get, and also the on-hit damage, right? It's very dangerous, and that's kept in check by the fact that Volibear is a melee champion who doesn't really have the tools to leverage a really insanely, multiplicative scaling on his passive, enabling him to deal significantly more damage as he builds AP. Uh, and Hecarim is kind of similar, where yeah, your Q deals more damage when you get AD, and then it also increases the amount of damage amp you get per rampage stack with AD, and that's kept in check partially by the fact that these champions are melee and these are damage outputs. And Tahm Kench is an interesting case where it shapes his builds to be different from other champions in a way that I think is really interesting, which is to say, normally when you are a tanky champion, like a tanky melee dude, and you want to build damage, you almost always want to buy damage in your early slots. And this scaling that Tahm Kench has on his passive actually flips that and says, actually, you can't buy damage in your early slots because it won't be very good until you already have health, which I actually think does a really interesting and cool thing for Tahm Kench, where he has a subversion of the normal build pattern in a way that I think actually is really interesting for him. However, it is really incredibly dangerous, and you can see that from the version of Tahm Kench that was around, before this ratio was nerfed significantly, where what actually happens is if Tahm Kench gets ahead, which especially was dangerous because Tahm Kench is a very powerful champion in the early game, or at least was back then. I don't know his current power curve exactly, but he would get ahead, and then if you built correctly, would never really fall off, right? Like your damage was just so high. Like your pattern would fall off for sure, but your damage would be so incredibly high. And it was very difficult for us to moderate that until we just nerfed this ratio down pretty significantly. And now it's not that powerful. And I don't know if it's really in the current game doing anything super different than just having a decent AP ratio on the passive. Maybe it is in terms of build ordering. I'm not sure. I'm not clear on that. But I'm a little bit skeptical of how many of these things there really are that are good for the game, just because of how complicated they can be and how they can shape your builds in really, really, really complex ways that can be hard to understand why that is. I think with Tahm Kench, it's not so bad because it's basically just, yeah, instead of buying a AP item first, like what a Zac or an Amumu would do, you just buy like a Riftmaker second or like a Proto Belt or whatever, right? And that's good after you finish your big HP item, whether that's a Protoplasm or a Heartsteel or whatever, isn't that important. But you want to get a big health item first, and then you buy some AP or whatever, right? Whatever the good version of that is. That's not too complicated, but Tahm Kench does this in a fairly straightforward, simple system, right? It'd be much more complicated, for example, if you did this with like AD and attack speed, or HP and attack speed, or and a lot of other combinations of stats would be way more complicated, partially because of their overlap with other with other stats and other systems. HP and AP specifically are an interesting case of doing this because HP and AP happen to be the two stats that are most independent, right? You can get the most of them on their own, right? We have items like Heartsteel, Protoplasm that give you pure HP. We have items like Death Cap and a lot of other AP items that give like the overwhelming majority of their value is indexed into pure AP, and so it's easier to index into that. Whereas most of our other stats come mixed, where it's like we don't really have a pure attack speed item, right? Phantom Dancer is the closest thing, and it's a crit item, as an example, right? We don't have a lot of other stats that don't end up being, heavily mixed with other stats on the items. Anyway, don't need to get into all of that. To answer the actual question here, the answer is probably yes, but we'd have to be very, 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 very careful about how we do this because of how it can create some incredibly powerful and very dangerous build incentives that can also be very confusing for players and hard to understand why the build is what it is or why you're building that way. I think if we keep it simple and we keep it straightforward, maybe it could be good on a few champions when we want to shape their build such that, hey, we want you to build this stat early and this other stat later on in the game. Yeah, maybe that could work, right? Particularly when we have a champion that's like hinging heavily upon one specific ratio, like Tahm Kench passive. Like Gwen passive is another example of this, where it's like, yeah, Gwen passive is her damage, right? So if we wanted Gwen to like build health later in the game, which we don't, by the way, but if we did, we could say make a health ratio on her passive that scales with AP. And so actually what you want to do is build AP early and then build health later on, right? As an example of something that could be, that could shape a build in a specific way, doing the reverse of Tahm Kench, if we wanted that, which again, I'm using that as an example, but we do not want that to be the case. But anyway, yeah, I think ultimately the answer is yes, we could do this, but we'd have to be very, 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 very careful because it's very easy for these kinds of multiplicative scalars to go wrong. This does mean that these champions tend to be really, really, really snowbally when we do things like this because their ratio is scaling with a stat, right? Which means that your ratio is scaling with your items, which is very dangerous. And when we create these kinds of your gold scales with gold type of effects, um, we can get ourselves into trouble, or we can get the game into trouble where it becomes very, very, very difficult to tune these champions around these kinds of ratios, specifically because they end up in these cases where uh, oh, I got ahead and therefore I'm getting more ahead. The game already has a lot of mechanics that do that. When the kits also multiply their stats for doing that, we have these accelerated snowball effects that can be very dangerous, which is again exactly what happened with Tom Kench for quite some time when he had these ratios before we ended up nerfing them. So definitely could be something we could do, but need to be pretty careful about it, I think. Why do enchanter items get mana regen while mage/tank items get max mana? So the distinction here is basically just that enchanters get mana regen and literally everyone else gets flat mana, right? Even Manamune, right, gives flat mana. And the answer is that there's a few different reasons. I think the main reasons have actually degraded over the years, and they're a little less necessary. But I still think this is doing some good things for the game and for systems, and so that's why it's still in the game. So the original reason was that in the olden days, right before the proliferation of heal and shield power, when we made items for enchanters, right, targeted at enchanters, they had AP on them, right? Because that was how enchanters scaled, just like mages. And so the way that we made a distinction between those items when we had mages buying enchanter items that we didn't want, or when we had enchanters buying mage items that we didn't want, was we said, okay, by giving enchanter items high multipliers to your mana regeneration, we can then tune the mana regeneration of our enchanters up so that they have high synergy with those, like the stat line on those items, and also tune the mage mana regenerations down so that they have low synergy with those items, and then make it so that mages have mana per level and they get a lot of flat mana. They'll still have to base eventually, but they can cast a lot of spells per base through a combination of buying flat mana and also gaining mana per level, right? And of course, mana per level is another lever here that's kind of invisible that people don't really think about, which is that mages generally have more mana per level, which then skews them toward, like mages, especially the ones that we want in mid lane, then skews them towards getting more experience, right? Because that of course rewards them for getting more levels. If we want a mage to be more functional in the support role, we typically give them more base mana, and then don't give them a ton of mana per level. So a lot of this is like finicky, like tuning stuff. But ultimately, I think because of heal and shield power existing, and we don't need nearly as much AP, or we've actually nerfed a lot of enchanter AP ratios over the years because they don't need those ratios as much anymore. And we've generally found that some of them are undesirable to be super high. Look at Sona, for example, as a champion who has much lower AP ratios today than she did like 15 years ago. But back in the day when enchanters were leveraging AP as their primary stat, this was a way for us to clearly differentiate a mage item versus an enchanter item in a way that allowed us to tune the items for the separate classes in the ways that we needed to tune them in order to get the outcomes that we wanted out of those items, right? And so today, I think there are still some desirable outcomes here, right? As an example, the support item has mana regen on it and health regen on it, right? But it doesn't have flat mana and health regen. It has percent health and mana regen, which actually means that the support item, right, the World Atlas, is actually better, like statistically, on enchanters than it is on regular mages, right? Which is really desirable because it allows us to tune those mages separately and like make mages like, yeah, this means that it's easier for us to make sure that Vel'Koz is functional in mid lane because he's not getting as much from the support item as he would if it was flat mana, for example, right? Because he has worse mana regeneration, or insert your favorite mage that we want to be viable in other roles, like Xerath, for example. Whereas otherwise, hey, these champions with high gameplay spells tend to be better when they have 2 targets to hit and don't have to CS, etc. Right? And there's very powerful binding to the support role. And if we want them to be viable in solo lanes, it's nice to have a stat binding that we can take advantage of in this way, right? And so I think we're still getting value out of this. There is also some consideration as well that we do want champions to base eventually, right? And mana regen can be dangerous for that reason. like offering a lot of mana regeneration, because that means that you can sort of like have infinite uptime or very, very high map uptime. Whereas flat mana, especially if you're a champion that consumes a lot of mana, right, like an Anivia, for example, flat mana doesn't let you stay out on the map forever, right? Like you will eventually run out because your regeneration will not equal up to what you're spending. Whereas if we give a lot of regeneration, we might run into situations where, hey, champions that we want to eventually have to base in solo lanes, that like are now clearing waves forever, right? Like Anivia is sitting under her tier 2 bot lane tower forever, wave clearing against the Jax, and the Jax never gets an opportunity to attack the side lane tower, right? Because she's just getting wave cleared out forever, right? We actually want there to be a reason why that Anivia has to base in that situation. We don't need to do that for supports, specifically because supports will have to base because they need wards or because they die because they're squishy and they don't have the same considerations around like wave clear and things like that. So I think there's a lot of good small reasons why this is still the way that it is. But I do think the main original reason why this was done, which was differentiation between the AP system and the enchanter system, is less necessary now because we have a better stat binding for it today, which is heal and shield power, than when this was originally designed, and we weren't using heal and shield power on as many enchanter items, and we didn't have as many clear tie-ins for enchanter items, right? Like Moonstone didn't exist, for example, back way back in the day. And so we didn't have as many clear, like, this is an enchanter item output versus this is a mage item output, right? You look at something like Shirelia's, it's like, well, Shirelia's is just a good item, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you're an enchanter or a mage, this is good even for just yourself, right? And we saw this, what was that, 2 years ago, 1 year ago, whatever, when, a lot of mages and Cho'Gath were buying Shirelia's in solo lanes because it was just good, right? And so having these stat differentiations, I think, is just generally good to allow us to tune the game in the ways that in ways that are desirable, so that mages can feel good about buying good mage items, and enchanters can feel good about buying good enchanter items, and we don't have to worry too much about poaching, and we have a way to tune it such that hey, you're buying something that's really off fantasy for your champion, or something that we can't tune very easily as an item, but we don't want to nerf it for the the enchanters or the mages or whatever class it's intended for. Hey, we have a way to tune that up or down, and generally that's like why this is still around today. Why does Riftmaker have Vamp and scaling with HP? Why not split the item? So this is actually kind of funny. Like, I remember reading this question originally and laughing a little bit, because Riftmaker is a merge of two items, right? It's a merge of the original Riftmaker, the Mythic version, and of the Demonic Embrace, which was removed. It had to go because I was putting Liandry's in the spot that Demonic Embrace was, which makes, I think, a lot more sense. And Liandry's, of course, when I was bringing back Haunting Guise, I wanted Haunting Guise as a bridge into that item space, the sustained damage space. I wanted an epic that would actually perform like that function. And so because of Haunting Guise, I needed some amount of damage amp on Riftmaker, and I wanted Riftmaker to gain damage amp comparatively to Haunting Guise. So it needed to be more than 6%. And Leandry's had to have damage amp instead of the HP to AP conversion. So I wanted a place to put the HP to AP conversion from Demonic Embrace, because I thought that was worth preserving, even though it's not allowed to be powerful. I'll get to that in a little bit. But I wanted a place to preserve that. But it couldn't be on Leandry's, because Leandry's is already doing two things, which is the burn and the damage amp from Haunting Guise. And I think that's more correct for that the Leandry slot, to have those effects. And so it made sense at the time, I think, to put that on Riftmaker, because Riftmaker was in an awkward position where I had to take the true damage conversion off of it, because true damage conversion is really powerful, and we wanted it to have more than 6% damage amp. And the mathematics of true damage conversion at pretty much anything, honestly, even anything more than like 5% damage amp, really crazy powerful. It's a really, really, really powerful effect. And in a non-mythic world, we couldn't sustain that power. And so that had to go. And so I was looking for, first of all, I made the vamp partially as a way to put the vamp on Riftmaker partially as a way to signal like what the purpose of the item is, and actually make that function, but also partially as a way of defraying the power into other, other mechanics, because we couldn't do the true damage was just way too much power on the item. So I had to take that, like the true damage conversion, so I had to take that away. I was looking for other ways to bring it back up, because we didn't just want to give all of that power as raw damage amp, right? There is a version of Riftmaker that gives like, it doesn't have the vamp, it doesn't have the HP to AP, but it has like, 12% or 15% damage amp or whatever. I don't know what the right number would be, but that's a boring item, right? And also probably not a super sustainable item, because that's a crazy amount of damage amp. So I was looking for ways to move the power into other areas. The vamp is one of those. And I think the HP to AP conversion made a lot of sense because it's a fairly low power rider, but it's an interesting rider to read, and it informs your build in a way that I think is actually pretty desirable, even if it's not like super heavily build informing because it's just not that powerful. It still is nice, I think, to read the line and look at that and say, like, oh, yeah, I'm getting paid out for buying further durability in my build after I buy this Riftmaker. Again, even if it's not that powerful. And so. Uh, to get into why the HP to AP conversion it can't be that powerful is that I tried that and it pretty much immediately started breaking stuff, right? You might notice if you look at Overlords in comparison to Riftmaker, the Overlord's conversion is way more powerful. It's literally more than twice as good because it numerically, Overlords is 2.5% of HP as AD. Riftmaker is 2% of AP, or sorry, 2% of HP as AD, or sorry, as AP. Uh, which means that Overlords is more than twice as good because AP is worth roughly, not exactly, but roughly about half as much per point as AD. And so because of that, if you just do out the math, you would look at that and say, like, well, wait, like Riftmaker should literally give more than double what it does today if it were the same as Overlords. And that is true. But when I tried doing that internally, stuff started breaking, like Cho'Gath and Vladimir, for example, started breaking things in ways that champions like Sion do not in the AD system. And I think a lot of that just comes down to like different gameplay around spells, different kits. I'm not going to get super in detail on that, but basically the TLDR is that the HP to AD, or sorry, the HP to AD conversion is actually allowed to be quite powerful, and so that can exist in an item pretty much on its own that is about that thing, right? Which is what Overlords is. Whereas the HP to AP conversion is not actually allowed to be that powerful because it just immediately starts breaking things like this Cho'Gath. Cho'Gath was just running around with like being extremely tanky and feasting people from 60%. And it's like, yeah, that's not okay. Vladimir was doing some, truly illegal things. And the answer was like, if we have to just make the champions that like the AP champions that get a lot of health from their kits, way less powerful in order to make this item good, then it's probably not worth it, right? I think it's different, by the way, when it's one champion versus a collection of champions. If it was just one champion and we had to tune them around that, I'd be a little bit more inclined. But this was more than one champion and pretty clearly was just breaking stuff in ways that were not super desirable. And so I moved away from a really powerful HP to AP conversion rate, even though I would love to, like, I think that could potentially be really cool for like Mordekaiser, for example. And in the modern day, I think we'd also run into problems with like Tahm Kench as an example, using like leveraging a really powerful version of that ratio. And so I think we've just created a lot of problem cases for that. And so because of all of that, I think that it is the HP to AP conversion has to, if it's in the item system, it has to exist as a rider and not the main thing on an item. And I think Riftmaker makes sense to be that item. Doesn't necessarily mean that we could never buff it, right? Like 2.5% is probably fine. Maybe 3% is okay. I tested 4% pretty extensively, and that was pretty clearly at the time too much. It has been a few years. Maybe things have changed. I kind of doubt it. But when I tried that in 2023, just stuff started breaking and, in pretty like, unsolvable. I think ways that seemed kind of unsolvable at the time. And so I just moderated the conversion rate back down and kind of called it a day and added it as a rider. So basically, to summarize my answer, it is that HP to AP conversion kind of has to be a rider because it's not allowed to be super powerful. Riftmaker could be that item. There could be another item that could have that rider. It's not important that it is Riftmaker in particular, though I think it's good for signaling what the build with Riftmaker should or could be. But, Riftmaker having Vamp is desirable for, hey, you are a sustained combat champion. The payout for going into sustained combat for a while is you can now heal off of your damage. This rewards you for having damage. It's a damage payout for being highly survivable. Now, is it the right amount of payout? Maybe not, right? Like maybe the Vamp on Riftmaker is too low. It's something I've been considering is that maybe the Omnivamp that it gives at like the payout is not high enough to incentivize the build. But I think it's actually kind of nice that it has one really clear passive that pays you out for being durable, being durable and having damage, and then one payout that says when you're durable, you get to deal more damage, right? It's, hey, if I'm durable enough to survive, I get this big damage amp payout, and of 8% damage amp, and then I get to vamp, and so if I do damage, I get to heal for that. And then it has another line that says, hey, by the way, if you build health, which makes you more durable, you get a little bit of damage for doing so. And I think the story of the item makes a lot of sense with the HP to AP conversion. And it's nice, it's nice structurally. Uh, but I also don't think it's critical. And if someone, pitched to me like, hey, someone working on a new item was like, hey, here is my pitch for a new, AP fighter item that has that passive, and we give Riftmaker something else, or we just like take that away from Riftmaker and buff Riftmaker in some other way. I think that could work, right? Like, I don't think that this is something that absolutely must be on Riftmaker, but I think it's a fine place for it to be overall. Caitlyn ult should execute. This person was talking about the sniper theme and how the ult, being flat damage doesn't really play very well into that. Interestingly enough, this is actually how, or at least I don't know if this is still true, but this is how we set up Caitlyn in Wild Rift. Was hey, it's kind of lame that your ultimate is usually used as a poking tool and not necessarily as a method of killing someone, and there's a lot more interesting tension around, if it hits, deals more damage to people at lower HP and it's less good against higher HP. It incentivizes the use cases in these interesting ways, etc. In general, I'm kind of like middling on it, right? Like, we've actually seen what it looks like in Wild Rift. It's fine, right? I don't think it's a significant upgrade or downgrade, like gameplay wise. Maybe thematically it's a little better, but I also think it's how do I put this? Um, I'm not super sold on the thematics being substantially better, like of this thing being an execute. Uh, it's maybe a little better, but it's also just like you're literally firing this gigantic bullet that takes you a really long time of channel. When that hits someone who's high HP and does very low damage, that there's some dissatisfaction, there's some dissonance there that's not super on theme. At the same time, also it's like when it hits a really tanky person after you channel for a bunch of time and it does very low damage, it's also lame. But that one's like, that's very critical, like load bearing for gameplay, that it actually just doesn't hit people who are really tanky for that much damage. In general, I like, this is the kind of thing where I personally want there to be a really, really, really clear, strong upside when we make a significant change to the gameplay of a champion, right? And something like this, I think, to me, is not clearly enough an upgrade that like I would want to like do this kind of thing. Now, other people feel differently. Like, other designers, I think operate differently than me. But to me personally, I consider any change to the gameplay of a champion to be a cost, right? Like, I think we're incurring a real cost when we change the game. I'm not talking about like this spell deals 5 more damage, or this cooldown is 1 second, shorter, or whatever, right? I'm talking about like the way that the thing is used is now different, or the use cases for a thing become different. I consider it to be a cost to change any champion in that way, because people who play that champion now need to relearn how to use this thing. Something that they may have played for hundreds or thousands of hours is different, and they need to learn how to use it differently. And so these kinds of changes, like these kind of like small gameplay changes, that maybe the theming is better, right? But is it enough better to be worth the cost of making all Caitlyn players relearn how to use their ultimate correctly? I'm not sure, right? Like, to me, it's probably not worth the cost. Even if I think it's like a light positive, asking Caitlyn players to play this thing really differently in a way that's maybe more fun for them, right? Like, maybe, but not clearly so, right? And to be clear, my opinion would change if we tried this out and we, brought in a bunch of Caitlyn players, and they were like, "Oh my god, I love playing with this," and and a bunch of Caitlyn players came and told me, "I really love killing people with my ult. I don't care about poking people at all." Like the fact that I can, ult a mage that's standing alone in mid lane and deal a lot of damage to them when they're full HP doesn't matter to me, right? Because you have to think about the things that you're giving up here, right? There are things that I think are cool about the fact that Caitlyn ult does just do a lot of damage baseline. Doesn't matter how high HP the target is. When, oh yeah, you think of the classic, like, oh, LeBlanc is farming a side wave, and then Caitlyn walks over from mid lane and just ults her and does half her HP, and then LeBlanc just kind of has to base, right? It's like, that's a power that I think some Caitlyn players really like, right? And we would be taking that away from them, right? And so, to me, I just don't see enough upside to personally justify this. I don't think all designers think the same way that I do. Like, all league gameplay designers think exactly the same way that I do about these kinds of changes. But to me, this reads as a little bit too side grady and like moderate risk, for me personally to be a big supporter of the idea. And partially that's because I've seen how this worked in Wild Rift, where we literally made this change. And it wasn't like suddenly Caitlyn players were thrilled about every single time they cast their ultimate. They had this amazing moment. It's like the reality is when the Caitlyn ult doesn't execute, you just don't get to cast it as much, right? You don't get to use the spell as much because the use cases are far more constricted. You have to be alive, see a target who is low, not be in range to auto attack them. There needs to not be someone who's high HP to block it, right? Like, et cetera, right? So, and maybe you throw it anyway in the case with a high HP target. But there are some real costs and some real trade-offs here. And so for me personally, I'm a little bit skeptical on doing this on like to Caitlyn generally speaking. Should Ludens have its CD refund mechanic back to compete with the other mana items? This one's a very easy answer. No. The cooldown refund mechanic had a very specific purpose, which was to support the mythic structure of champions choosing between these different items from game to game, and there being really compelling choice in the system, right? Which is not actually how people buy items, right? What we want out of the item system is that your items feel good for you, right? Each item has a specific purpose, and it feels good when you use it for that purpose, and it is high synergy with the champions that want to index into that thing. Ludens is for burst damage, right? We want to make sure above all else that when you are indexing into a burst pattern, your Ludens feels good for you. When you are LeBlanc and you buy a Ludens, you should feel good about that, right? And we wouldn't want to take away power from Ludens because it is roughly appropriately powerful on live in order to make it more powerful on champions who want to repeat their patterns. Partially, that's because if you want to repeat your pattern multiple times, we already have an item for you. It's called Blackfire Torch, right? It doesn't actually make that much sense to go to Ludens and say, hey, I'm going to add a mechanic that rewards you for casting multiple spells, and hitting multiple champions with multiple spells. Because we already have an item that does that called Blackfire Torch, right? And so this is one where I think the answer is very, very clear cut. No, absolutely not. Luden should not have this mechanic because it is antithetical to its purpose as an item, and it would put it in direct competition with another item that does that thing in a more compelling and more satisfying way that asks you to repeat your pattern multiple times, right? To cast spells multiple times and hit a lot of enemies with your spells, right? And so this is one, I think a lot of the questions that I answer here the answers are not very clear cut, and I can give you, sort of my thoughts on the situation, but it's like, even the previous question as an example, like Caitlyn Ultra, it's like I can easily imagine versions of Caitlyn where we would want to do this, right? If we were making changes to Caitlyn, right? Even, if I were doing the work myself, even though I'm a little skeptical on that individual mechanic being worth it on its own, just like cost of change versus value that we're getting, and the risk that we're incurring. But I can easily imagine that being something that we would want to do at some point in the future, right? But this is one where I think it's pretty clear cut. We have done a lot of investigation on items in general over the years, especially, since the Mythic system was introduced. And I think it's pretty clear this is the kind of thing that we definitively do not want to do, which is make the items more similar to each other and wash out their individual purposes in the name of choice, right? Because actually what we're doing there is we're just making the items boring. We're making them less interesting and less suited to their specific purposes in order to pretend that then creates a really interesting, compelling dynamic where people choose between them, which doesn't really exist, right? What we're actually doing is making it confusing for players and hard for them to understand even why they would want to buy one over the other, right? And I think that that's really where we end up with these kinds of mechanics. It is the items end up being kind of soupy, where it's like, well, it doesn't really matter what you buy, you're doing the same thing. Whereas on live right now, playing Luden's Orianna versus Blackfire Torch Orianna is a really different experience. And I think that's a huge positive that we have choice between those items on Orianna. They're both good on her, right? But you have a really, really, really different pattern when you buy one versus the other. And I think that is what the value of the item system is bringing. And adding mechanics like this that make the items more similar to each other degrades the functionality of the item system, which is enhancing your character fantasy in a compelling direction, right? Because it means that that direction has been muted, it's been softened, because Luden's is now more like Blackfire Torch. It's, asking you to do the same thing, and get a payout for doing the same actions, right? And so this is one I feel very strongly about, has a very strong answer, is no. I do not, I would be very strongly opposed to doing anything in this space. Can we have more basic ability ults, like Zoe, low cooldown, low impact, high kit synergy? Sure. I mean, these are. I think these can be really cool. Part of the reason why we tend to not make these that often is because having a really long cooldown on your ultimate is one way we can create very clear windowed high fantasy moments for a given champion, right? It's very easy to make a really compelling high moment, and we do want our champions to have really compelling high moments. It's easy to create them in a very clear and understandable way to the player when your ultimate has a 120 or even more second cooldown, and it makes you really powerful or lets you do something really transgressive for your character. The clever thing about Zoe, and I think some of the other champions that are in this space, is they build their, like Zoe in particular, I think has a set of high moments on the base kit that work really well with the ultimate, right? It's like she has the EQ combo where that's a really high moment, and as you get over the course, scale over the course of the game, maybe you can kill someone from a really high amount of HP, maybe even 100% when you hit your EQ, and your ult plays into that fantasy, even though that's something that you don't achieve very often on your base kit, right? I think it's pretty difficult to do these basic ability ults on traditional mage kits because one of the things I've talked about before, I don't remember which Q&A it is, some number, many numbers ago, I think. But one of the things I talk about previously I've talked about previously in some of my Q&As, is that mages typically get a lot of damage from their ultimate because that's a good way for us to give them variance in their combat pattern. Because a lot of mages, you look at like Ari, for example, it's like Ari can't be allowed to just kill you when she hits charm, right? Because she can hit all of her basic abilities. And one of the ways in which we make her ultimate really compelling and interesting is not only does it do a lot of damage, is it basically like borderline guarantees that you can hit a second rotation of some of your spells. Like you can hit your second Q pretty easily when you're running your ultimate, right? And that makes it so that Ari then gets to kill you when she has her ult, and she doesn't when it's down, right? Which is important because she has range, she has CC, she has a lot of tools, and one of the ways we limit her and give her high moments is to say, yeah, it's hard to kill people without your ultimate unless they're already quite low, right? And that's okay, right? If you hit someone with multiple rotations of your spells without your ultimate, that's fine, right? But it's hard for us to make mages in particular have high moments in this way, because mages aren't really allowed to 100 to 0 people without their ultimate unless they're really fed, or they have like some really crazy gameplay around that, like Zoe. Anyway, I've kind of spun off into some irrelevant tangents here, but some people like that, so I'll probably keep this for the video. Anyway, who knows? Maybe I'll cut this. Ultimately, I think these kinds of kits are very hard to make because they need a really compelling high moment on the base kit that can't happen too often, which is hard to make, right? It means you need to have really high variance base kit spells, which not a lot of our champions have, but some do, right? Like, again, Zoe, I think, is a particularly great example of this. But I think it would be cool to make these. I think in general, champions where the ultimate is not the high moment are really cool. Certainly T, I think, was incredible at making these kinds of champions, right? Thresh is another really a good example of this, where the ult is not the high moment for Thresh, right? The box is not an important part of his kit. It can play into his kit, right? And it still has a real cooldown, right? Unlike Zoe are. But this is the kind of design I think can be really cool when we find the right place for it. But it's very hard to do, very hard to execute, I think, because the kit does still need really compelling. Like every kit does still need compelling high moments to be a really compelling kit. And so, I'm not even a champion designer, but from my perspective as a systems designer, yeah, we could definitely have more of these. They're hard to make, but I think it would be cool to have more of these champions. But I don't really have anything super specific to say about it. Tarek Rakan and other cases of a melee enchanter and the possibility of more. Personally, I think these champions are really cool, and I would love to make more itemization support for them. This is one of the things that's kind of like, I don't know if I would quite say it's like my white whale, but it's something that I've tried spinning up before and would really, really, really like to create some crossover in the item system, like some items that exist in the space between what's the right terminology for this? The enchanter space and the like melee supportive melee space. I guess is the best way of putting it. Not necessarily like Giga Tank, right? But The difficulty with, I think there's several different difficulties with this. One of them is that when we make enchanter items that give you a lot of durability, uh, they tend to start, like, depending on what they do, they tend to start causing some undesirable outcomes. Let's say, like, I think last year's redemption is a really good example of this. Like, yeah, everyone just like everyone, every tank support and every enchanter is just buying redemption, right? Which is why we moved the stat line from HP to AP, so that it was more binding for enchanters, and tanks would need to give up more in order to go for redemption. Uh, so there's some risk here for sure. I think finding the right combination of stat line and effects is really difficult, but I would love to make some items in this space, because I do think that these champions, like, the way that they work is really interesting and compelling. Like, the idea that there's like risk versus reward, and the reward isn't just your personal durability, or locking the enemies down, but the reward is instead enhancing your allies in a variety of different ways. Like Taric Q plus passive plays really well into this, where it's like, oh, the payout for hitting someone on Taric is healing yourself, right? It's personal durability, but also healing your allies, right? Really cool. I think that's awesome, right? Recon Q is kind of similar. Of course, Recon Q is a ranged spell, though, so it doesn't really work quite the same way. But of course, going really close to someone does mean you'll hit your Q, right? But I think there is something really cool about this. I would love to create more support for them personally, as a as someone who works on the item system a lot, and I definitely could see us making more champions in this space because they tend to be really, really cool. And I think there is something really compelling about this, that we compelling about this fantasy, that we don't offer a lot of champions to play into, which could be really cool. So yeah, I like this idea. I do think these champions can be really cool, and I would love for us to make more of them at some point. Why armor/MR shards got removed? So this is a pretty clear one. The reason why they got removed is that they created a uh, no upside situation, and I'm gonna explain what I mean by that. What the armored MR shards did when they weren't health, right? Because we just changed them to a different form of defense, right? Was, here's the situation. Imagine you are in solo queue and you are deciding on your runes before the game, and you are seeing, hey, the enemy solo laners are Pantheon and Akali, and I don't know which one I'm against. If you choose your stat shard correctly, whether you pick armor against Pantheon or MR against Akali, when you choose correctly, you have a normal laning experience, and the game is normal, and you don't feel good about that, right? You don't feel clever, you don't feel like you got away with something, right? You just feel like you're having a normal laning experience, because the default is that you get the correct resistance for your opponent. However, when you pick the wrong one, you then have a really miserable laning experience, and your opponent doesn't even really feel good about this. They probably don't even know most of the time that this happened. They just feel like they're doing more damage and that they're generally going to win against you. And you feel bad that you picked the wrong one because you thought it was going to be Akali top and it was actually Pantheon, or you thought it was going to be Pantheon mid and it was actually Akali, or whatever, right? And so essentially what we set up here was that this was just a no-win situation where, or I guess maybe not no win. It shouldn't be that way. Like, there is a win. This is just a feels negative situation where the only outcomes are negative. There's no positive outcome. And so by changing this to health, we created a situation where we basically just removed the negative outcomes here. Now, of course, this had some small implications for champions that scale with resistances, specifically like Galio and Malphite. And, of course, they've been, balanced a little bit differently since that, that change was made. But the reason why this was removed was because we didn't like the no-win situation, or not no-win, the negative feel situation that this created. There were also at the time, I don't think this played out particularly well, but there were also at the time a lot of people that believed it was likely that part of the power level of mage bot lane, why a lot of mages were really high with win rate in bot lane, was that AD carries and supports wouldn't switch their stat shards to MR. Now, that I don't think really played out as being true, right? Like, didn't really seem to make much of a difference. A lot of mage bot lanes are still very powerful, both before and after this change was made. But the main reason, like the main motivation to make this change, was that the result of having armor and MR was most of the time you have a normal experience, but sometimes you have a bad experience. In the health world, you just always have a normal experience, right? And getting away with something is still something you can do by taking health per level, right? You could choose between an early game and a late game scaling option, and that's something you can still do. You can still get punished for that. You can still feel good about that. You can still feel bad about that. That's all pretty much the same as the old system. We've just removed the case where you feel bad because you picked the wrong flat resistance against your lane opponent. And ultimately, that's why this was changed, why this was removed, was the feels bad situation of picking the wrong thing. All right, last question for today's video. Why does Muramana only apply its effects against champions? So, a little bit of a history lesson here. Muramana used to be a toggle, and it used to be that you would just turn it on and it would eat your mana whenever you hit something, and it would deal bonus damage based on how much mana it ate, basically. This was changed for a number of reasons. One of the big ones being that it was like the toggle was a lot of mind share for what really didn't feel like a payout that was worth it. Because really, actually, what it was you should just always turn this on against champions and generally always turn it off against minions, because it's just not worth spending the mana on dealing a little bit of extra damage to minions. And so it made a lot more sense to just say, okay, look, we don't really need this mana consumption thing probably if it just doesn't work against minions, because it working against minions gave a lot of it did give a lot of wave clear, and there were situations where you should turn where it was correct for you to turn it on against minions, even if that was rare. But we didn't really value that granular fine control over just having a simpler version of the item that would just work, right? Because one of the problems, of course, with this item was it was hard to tune for lower and higher skill players, because lower skill players would just never turn it on at all, right? And higher skill players would perfectly manage it, but in many cases would not feel like the output that it was giving was worth the amount of management and thought that they had to put into it. Basically, the juice wasn't really worth the squeeze in terms of having this thing be a toggle, in terms of how much mind share it occupied. And so we ended up moving to a version where, okay, you don't have to think about this thing at all. We want the thing to be powerful as we can reasonably make it against champions. Therefore, the easiest way of getting a powerful version of against champions is to say it doesn't affect minions. The thing is, Manamune gives a lot of AD. It's kind of funny looking at Manamune. It's like Manamune gives a lot more damage against minions than most other items that champions that buy Manamune would ever want, right? Like lethality champions that buy Manamune, for example, lethality doesn't do much against minions. I mean, they do have armor now, right? But it's still not that effective. And so the fact that Manamune gives a ton of AD in its slot means that it is actually a pretty good item for wave clear for champions that buy it for the most part, because most of their wave clear is driven by AD, not just from their auto attacks, but from ratios on their spells, right? And so ultimately, I think this is just a case of, yeah, it's kind of like it only applies its effect against champions because that's probably like shape wise correct for the item, that it has all of its power budget of the unique passive against champions. Whereas if we made it against work against minions, we'd probably have to nerf it in some way, either give a little bit less AD, which is less cool, or it would have to deal a little bit less damage against champions. It already gives plenty of wave clear just through the AD, and so I just don't think we really value this thing affecting minions in the same way, or that it would need to affect minions in the same way, because it would just have to be less powerful, probably, because it is a lot of wave clear to just say your spells deal extra flat damage, right? There are some champions that cast a lot of spells very quickly, right? And so it's a lot easier to tune it against champions and have it be powerful there than it would be against minions. And that's really not that complicated. All right, so that's it for today. As is usual, thanks everybody for watching. I will pretty clearly need to fill in my question doc for next one. I don't think these two are going to cover an hour. Yeah, I'll need to fill in some questions. I don't do that often, but that'll have to be something I'll do for next video. Thanks for watching, and I guess maybe catch you next time, or not if you didn't like it. If you didn't like it, I'm not sure why you're watching an outro, since that means you probably watched an entire over an hour's worth of content, but yeah, if that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do. Yeah, see ya.